and I'll be chairing this session, in which Professor Ramakumar from TIS Mumbai will discuss the COVID-19 pandemic and rural India, economic impacts and policy responses. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Sreya Senha from University of Cambridge and Enrique Castagnon-Bolivian here from SOAS. The Agrarian Change Seminar Series organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. This year, the seminar series will, for obvious reasons, run as webinars. You can find the full program of the series on our website, Agrarian Questions, which is aqs.org.uk. We will put the URL in the chat sooner or later. The webinar is also live streamed on YouTube. The link for that will also be put in the chat, and feel free to circulate. Before we start, here are some guidelines for participants. Firstly, please keep your microphone off. So far, we have kept it off for you, except when contributing to the discussion. Secondly, we want the webinar to be as interactive as possible. So you can write questions and comments in the chat at any point in time. And the chat button, you can find that at the bottom bar on your screen. So writing questions and comments also goes for those, both for those in the webinar and for those of you that have joined us through the YouTube live stream. For the question and answer session that will follow the presentation, those in the webinar can ask live questions. Simply use the raised hand function. If you click on the participant button at the bottom line, you will see the hand raising option. We will also monitor the two chats for written questions. And of course, when asking a question or making a comment, please be considerate and respectful. Finally, we're going to record both the audio and the video of the session. So if you do not wish to be recorded, simply don't use your audio and video. It is now time to welcome today's speaker, Professor R. Ramakumar from the School of Development Studies of the Tata Institute of Social Science in Mumbai, where he holds the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development chair. He's also a member of the State Planning Board of the state of Kerala. He holds a PhD in economics from the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, and he's a leading scholar of agrarian change in rural India, which is why he's here. That said, his research interests are more wide-ranging than that. They go well beyond agrarian issues, as his excellent book, Note-Bandi, Demonetisation and India's Elusive Chase for Black Money from 2018 illustrates very well. Throughout his career, Ramakumar has mixed field-based studies with statistical-based analysis of a number of aspects of agrarian and rural development and beyond. And he has published widely, including in the Journal of Agrarian Change, where he won the 2017 Bernstein and Byers Prize for his article, Jats, Carbs and Riots, Communal Politics and the Bharatiya Kisan Union in Northern India. He's also a prolific public intellectual, a commentator called on by TV, newspapers and magazines, and he has an active Twitter profile. During the last half year or so, Ramakumar has provided us with insights into the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on rural India, published in, among other places, the journal Review of Agrarian Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome him today to present on the topic COVID-19 pandemic and rural India, economic impacts and policy responses. He will present his talk in 45 to 50 minutes. And I'll hand over to him in 1 second. Just also say that for those of you that might watch this on phones, it is best to hold the phone so you get a landscape view so that you can see the graphs properly. And that's all for me. Over to you, Ramakumar.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jens, for that very kind and generous introduction. Good evening, good morning, to people from different parts of the world, wherever you are, sometimes good afternoon as well. Thank you very much for the Journal of Agrarian Change and Department of Development Studies in SOAS for inviting me to give this seminar. I'm very grateful to them. I remember having spoken at this platform about 9 years back when I was in London, and I'm very happy to be back speaking in this seminar series, which is very distinguished, as the other speaker names would attest to. So let me get straight into my topic, and I shall share my screen now. And as Jens warned you as an alert, there's some graphs and tables, so it might be better if you keep your phone horizontal and watch it. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to speak on COVID-19 pandemic and rural India, economic impacts and policy responses. Now, when you speak about the crisis, we have to start, as is customary, that this is an unprecedented crisis. Nobody has ever seen a crisis of this sort, and that indeed is one of the key features of this crisis. This is a crisis where you have both the demand and supply coming together rather simultaneously, yet having autonomous sources of decline. This is also a crisis where classical Keynesian demand stimulus policies or classical policies to stimulate supply, etc., or bailout of banks, etc., as we have known in the past, that kind of traditional, conventional policy responses are unlikely to work independently. Probably you need a certain admixture of them, and no one knows how best to respond. Let's all accept it. Economists or scholars from the right, center, left, they're all in a bit of a fix as to how best to respond to this. So we're all learning as we see the crisis and we experience it, and it goes by. A lot of what I'm trying to say, a lot of matters that are spoken about the crisis are in the form of speculations, projections, etc. Some are very educated ones, some are not. But I shall, in this presentation, try to keep my points limited to what I can surely say with data. That's what I shall try to do. I shall not speculate beyond a point, but I shall only when I can make an educated speculation. So let me move into my presentation. Now, my structure, the structure of this presentation is going to be of this kind. I shall be starting with the nature of the pandemic and its spread in rural India, which is the focus of this presentation. Following which, I shall move into its impacts on agriculture. Here, I shall speak about harvest costs. I shall speak about disruptions in supply chains. I shall speak about food inflation and its relationship with supply chains. I shall speak about agricultural inputs. I shall also speak about another input, of course, but agricultural credit. Then I shall move into questions of rural employment. I shall move into questions of rural incomes, rural food consumption, which will lead me to how the government has reacted to this crisis after May 24th, when the lockdown was imposed, and some points about what I think should be the way ahead. So that's going to be the broad structure of my presentation. Let me first begin with the point on the pandemic in rural India. This is one area where there isn't much good data that is available because the spread of the pandemic, the death rates, fatality rates, etc., across rural and urban areas is not yet fully accurately available. Partly because we only have a census that was conducted about 9 to 10 years ago, but partly because of the paucity of data. Because of all these reasons, we do not have good data on this. But here again, I'm relying on somebody else who has done this kind of work. Financial Express, for example, carried an analysis recently, which points out very clearly that as of September 2020, the pandemic in India is largely urban-centered, urban and semi-urban center. It hasn't yet moved into rural areas in a substantive way. That's the broad point that we can safely make. If you look at September 27, the pie chart below, you will see that about less than 25% of the cases are now seen in rural areas, and sort of, if you add semi-urban to it, rural and semi-urban together, rest of 75% of cases has been in urban areas. So that's the key. But at the same time, come October, you are slowly seeing the spread of the virus into rural areas, which are completely ill-equipped to deal with this with a crisis of this sort. So that's a crisis that is yet to explode on our faces here. But this is what the broad picture actually shows. This is also seen with some data that we have about districts with the most reported fatalities. The first one is infections. This is deaths. If you look at fatalities, you will very clearly see that most of the cases that you see are in big cities: Mumbai, Pune, Thane, Chennai, Bangalore, Nagpur, Ahmedabad, Kolkata, etc. It's only towards the bottom that you see districts with a substantial rural component or rural population among them. Raigad, Sangli, Sholapur, North 24 Parganas, Satara, Aurangabad, Palghar. These are districts with low fatality numbers, but these are substantively rural. They have substantively rural populations. So the virus hasn't quite entered the rural areas as yet, but it will. And the point that I'm going to make from here onwards is that, but the impact has been disproportionate. Though the virus has been not quite entered the rural areas, the economic impact that it has already caused in rural areas, in agriculture, has been substantive. That's the point that I want to begin from here onwards. The impact on agriculture. There are different types of impacts on agriculture that you see, but I shall start with the first, which is when the harvest cost during the Rabi season. For those who are unfamiliar with Indian seasons, Rabi is the second crop in India, which is sown during the winter time in about November or December, harvested in March, April, and May. That's the crop cycle of Rabi season, largely in northern parts of India. Wheat is the most important Rabi crop that you have. South India has a little bit of Rabi rice, but if at an all India level, it's largely Rabi wheat, which is the predominant crop. So the Rabi harvest was beginning when the lockdowns were announced on the 24th of March 2020. The most important damage that the lockdown caused was in the form of shortage of migrant agricultural laborers. It is estimated that in states like Punjab and Haryana, about 1 million or 0.6 million migrant farm workers are there who are largely involved in the harvesting operations. They come largely from eastern parts of India, Odisha, the West Bengal, Bihar, Assam, Jharkhand, etc. And that flow of migrant workers into Punjab and Haryana largely stopped. It was not just a case of Punjab and Haryana. Whichever places, for example, harvests of Rabi crops in Maharashtra involves migration of migrant farm workers from other districts within Maharashtra. That also was adversely affected during this time. So this meant that there was a sharp rise in harvest costs. As, for example, laborers were not available, number one. Number two, if you want to rely on mechanization, it means that rents on implements also rose because they were in fixed supply. So if you would pay about 2,000 rupees a day for a tractor prior to the lockdown, you would now pay the double of it, 4,000 rupees per lockdown. That's a one example I'm giving. The rates may differ, but that's one case that I surely know of. As a result, the government itself, because of the lockdown, postponed the beginning of the procurement operations of the state, which it staggered it after it's announced that it would start it only after April 1st. As a result, wheat harvests were postponed. As a result, this had also created problems of cash flow in rural areas, because a lot of things depend upon how cash begins to flow in from income from procurement, sales, and so on, and also in trade in large APMC markets. So this meant that cash flow in rural areas was also obstructed. So this is the broad beginning point we have with respect to Rabi harvest. Surveys conducted by Foundation for Agrarian Studies show that for the harvest of Rabi crops, larger farmers relied more on mechanization, but smaller farmers had relied more on the intensified use of family labor. And there are some villages where wage rates rose, and some other villages where wage rates fell, where migrant workers are moving from and where to. This largely meant that where a large number of migrant workers returned to the villages, in those cases, there was excess supply and wage rates fell in those villages. In other cases, the wage rates rose. Surveys by Azim Premji University also show that 37% of farmers were unable to harvest, 15% were unable to sell, 37% sold the harvest as a at a reduced price, 12% sold the harvest at a regular or higher price. So that's a broad picture that you see of farmers' losses. IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute surveys in Haryana and Odisha, April to May, show this you will see the part that I've marked out. About 41% of the farmers in Haryana and 80% of the black gram farmers in Odisha spent more on harvest. They spend more on labor for harvest, more on machinery for harvest, more on transport to the market. So all these constituted very clearly a certain rise in harvest costs in the Rabi season in India, which coincided with the lockdown period. Now that takes me to the next point, which is disruptions in supply chains, which was the next important impact that you had in rural areas. Very clearly, there are international and domestic supply chains which are involved. I'll first talk about international supply chains with respect to exports, and then I shall come into ports and logistics, and then I shall follow it up with a discussion on domestic supply chains. If you look at exports, global merchandise trade, if you see, these are data from WTO on world merchandise trade, you can see the clear dip in 2020. There's a recovery that is expected in 2021, but that is likely to be very moderate. In fact, in the April to June quarter, world merchandise trade shrank by minus 14.3%, and 2021 is expected to have plus 7.2, but that's still likely to be lower than the pre-COVID levels. However, the agricultural trade is not as badly affected as either total merchandise trade or fuels and mining products or manufacturers. The Q2, that is April to June quarter of 2020, saw only shrinkage of world agricultural trade by minus 5%, while the negative growth rates are much higher for other products that you see in the picture. Now, this brings me to India. A very interesting feature of Indian agricultural exports that you see during the period of the lockdown is that there isn't much of a change that you see in agricultural exports. If you consider the cumulative figures for April to August of 1920 and 2021, you will see this part of the graph. They appear to be largely same. You have about $91 million less in 2020-21 as compared to 2019-20. That might be something that might come to be interesting to many, but I have an explanation for this. If you look at, the point is there are large intercommodity differences in the point that we are talking about. Basically, what India has done is India has managed to export more compared to 2019 of rice, sugar, and cotton. Particularly rice and sugar, they have exported far more quantities in 2021 as compared to 2019-20. And this is what reflects in the kind of compensation that you see, which you will see, which when I show numbers for other commodities, you will clearly see that. This is the first point that I want to make. If you see rice, you will see that the rice's share in the total agricultural, the total value of agricultural products exported rose from 18% to 23% this April-August. If you see sugar and molasses, it rose from 5.1% to around 8%. These numbers are why you have export numbers showing up to be as good as 2019-20. However, these are only 6 out of 15 commodities that I'm talking about. If I consider the rest 9 out of 15 commodities, you will see for them there are significant losses in exports compared to 1920. The largest sufferer has been marine products. So fisher households have been very significantly affected. Fish processing industries have been affected. Meat and meat products is another casualty in this time. About $336 million less this year. Spices, large number of small and marginal farmers in Kerala and Tamil Nadu cultivate spices. They have been adversely affected. Tea, tobacco, different kinds of oils, poultry, coffee, all these are cases where you have less exports this year. In all these cases, you will see the export shares have come down 18.9 to 14.7% for meat and marine products. For meat products, 9.4 to 7.2%. 11.4 to 10.8% for spices, 2.5 to 2% for tea. You can see these commodities. So the point I'm trying to make is, overall, in a macro sense, India appears to have kept its exports as good as in 2019-20, but there are large intercommodity differences inside. Rice, wheat, etc., have been pushed more because you had a good harvest in Rabi. They have been pushed into the export market, but suffered a lot in terms of other commodities. Coming to ports and logistics, there's a very significant impact that you see. For example, this is a typical chain of export logistics that you would see. If you have a processing factory here, you would actually either first move it to an inland container depot and then move it on a railhead to the nearest port. Or if you're fully doing it by lorries or tempos or trucks, you would move at least 3 or 4 state borders and then finally reach the destination. This whole process, for example, if you're exporting tea from Assam through the Kolkata port, you will see that this whole process takes about 5 to 6 days. If you're basmati rice exporter from Karnal to Mundra port in Gujarat, that takes another about 6 to 8 days for this whole process to be completed. If you're exporting meats from Dadri in UP to JNPT port in Mumbai, that takes about 3 to 5 days. On an average. So all these things were severely affected because traffic was not moving. All these export logistic chains were in a state of breakdown. Some were very slow, some were simply not happening. All that was yet another impact that you saw. So of course, export markets were not working, exports were not happening, but part of the reason was also that your whole port logistics system, export logistics system also broke down during this period. So that's what is there about exports and ports and logistics. Coming to domestic supply chains, here again there was significant impact of the lockdown. There are multiple types of impacts that you would see in the domestic agricultural trade. There was delayed procurement, as I said. The government actually procured more than last year. To their credit, they procured more than last year compared to 2019. There was more procurement in 2020, but the procurement was delayed. The higher procurement was only from few states. It did not happen in all states. All those are its negatives. Villages did not see traders who would come in to purchase the produce of farmers as in the regular year. There was shortage of trucks, which because about 500,000 trucks were stuck in the highways of India sometime in May, and they were not moving. If trucks were available, truck drivers were not available because most of the truck drivers were migrant workers. In many cases, mandis closed down because traders were infected with the virus. In the city where I live, the Vashi APMC market in Mumbai closed down for almost the whole of the April and May because some traders had tested positive. Similar thing happened in Pune. And retail markets also, the small retail markets that you would see outside bus stations, railway stations, etc., selling fruits, vegetables, all those were shut down by the police. So that also added to the disruptions in supply chain. The most important impact that you would see is in the number of reporting agricultural markets. If you look at the number of reporting agricultural markets in India, you would see the top line is for 2019 monthly, and the bottom line is for 2020. You would clearly see that about 300 to 400 markets on an average were less in terms of number of markets in operation. If about, even in September, if 2,169 markets were open in 2019, we had only 1,837 markets open in 2020. Supply chain disruptions are a continuing feature in Indian agriculture. It's not that it has been eased after June, July, or anything. As you move from lockdown 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0 to 4.0, in fact, disruptions have continued. That's the point that you see in this particular graph. I shall add a few more to this. These are market arrivals in 2020 as a share of market arrivals in 2019. Right, that's the data that you see here. I have given the whole of data that's March to September in the first column, but then I've split it into March to June and July to September to see if supply chains have eased. After July, you will very clearly see that it hasn't. The point number one is if you take the most important Rabi crop, wheat, only 60% of the market arrivals of 2019 were reported as market arrivals in 2020. That's a huge fall for the most important Rabi crop. Only very marginal part of the difference was absorbed by higher procurement. The rest, you don't know where it went. It might have been sold as part of distress sales of farmers, or wherever. You don't know how that was sent, how that was sold, but very clearly it was sold at lower prices for sure, because it did not have access to systematic regulated markets. You would see other crops: barley 51.6, gram 39.7. You will come down to vegetables, onion 46.8, cabbage and cauliflower are slightly better, but when you come to peas, it's about 39.4. If you come to a important summer crop like mango, which floods the which floods the markets in India during summer, only 46.8% of the arrivals of 2019 were reported in 2020. This is a complete breakdown of supply chains, and these supply chains are showing no signs of coming back to normal even by September of 2020. That's the point that comes out. Huge losses have been suffered by farmers because of the lower market arrivals, because much of the rest would have been sold, the remainder would have been sold at lower prices in some unregulated market to some trader. There are also cases of crop destroyal and dumping by many farmers, which have also been reported. So that's about market arrivals in 2020. Huge fall across commodities. If you look at, these are graphs for the same. On the right side, you will see the graph for wheat. These are cumulative arrivals from January up to September. You will see that the blue line is for 2019 and the red line is for 2020. 2020 is far below the point for 2020 is far below the line for 2019. You can see. I can show that for other crops. I will not actually, because the numbers have already been presented in the table. You can see in every crop, the red is far below the blue. Barley, gram, pigeon pea, lentil, potato, tomato, onion, cabbage, cauliflower, peas, lady's finger, banana, mango. Banana was slightly better than other crops. You can see that the difference is less, but in a crop like mango, you can see the widening difference there. So this is the point about market arrivals with respect to agricultural crops. Similar was reported in the case of milk as well. Milk supply chains also broke down on a mass scale. The amount of milk that was procured was about 534.2 lakh liters per day in the month of February, March, which fell to 503.9 lakh liters per day by the end of May. Now, there is a point here, which is that in summer, milk production itself comes down a little bit. So it will certainly reflect in less procurement. But the reason why I'm showing this graph nevertheless is because of the government's claim that it had procured 560 lakh liters per day from the farmers during April and May. It was completely wrong. Data from the National Dairy Development Board actually show that the numbers were far below the claims made by the government. In fact, procurement actually fell during this period. Sales also fell. That's obvious because sweet shops closed down, roadside tea shops closed down. There's a huge fall in demand for milk, and that is very clearly reflected in a more rapid fall in the sale of milk rather than in the procurement of milk. That's not surprising, but the government completely failed to procure enough quantities of milk. There is some data that comes out which shows that the 2020 procurement was still more than the 2019 procurement, but basically the 11% higher. But I'm very skeptical. This has not come from an official source, but informally from an official source. But because it is the same source that has given these numbers out, I'm a little skeptical about these numbers as well. But I thought for fairness, I should provide this data as well in the slide. There is this argument as well that 2020 procurement was more than 2019 procurement, but I would still be skeptical of this claim until I see properly audited official data in this regard. Now, but the key problem with milk is the phenomenal fall in milk prices. And this picture actually shows, if you these are numbers from IFCN, that is the International Farm Comparison Network based in Kiel in Germany. You will see that for an average of 75 countries, the fall of prices in milk was minus 4.5%. So that's the fall of price of milk that you see on an average. But if you see two places, United States and India, these are epicenters of price fall, as IFCN puts it. In India, the decline in price was 19% in this time, and in the United States, the price decline was 29%. So United States and India were epicenters of a precipitous fall in the milk prices in this time. In India, milk prices fell from rupees 35 per kg, per liter for a farmer, to about 17 to 18 rupees per liter. That's the kind of a fall that you saw in this time. So milk farmers have been in great crisis because of this this price fall. That's about milk. Come to meat. There was a crisis prior to the pandemic as well. The African swine fever was everywhere. Prior to the pandemic, in the state of Assam, about 14,000 pigs were slaughtered in just 14 days. Because of African swine fever. It was not just in China, it happened in India as well. And plus there were rumors on the adverse health impacts of non-vegetarian food. If you eat chicken, meat, etc., you will get COVID. That was the kind of wisdom sprouted out from the WhatsApp universities of India. So this primarily meant that the meat consumption and production both fell drastically. I can give you the example of the abattoir very close to the place I work. My office is very close to the abattoir, Devnar abattoir, which is the largest in Western India. About 250 buffaloes and 3,000 sheep and goats are slaughtered here on a daily basis, where animals come from other states like Rajasthan, Gujarat, and other Maharashtra districts. This abattoir had completely closed down in April 2020. As a result, though, if you take Mumbai city as a whole, the sales fell by 50%, and prices of meat rose by 50 to 80% as a result of the shortage. That's the kind of impact that you see. In poultry sector, you will see similar set of losses. These are losses for small poultry growers in homesteads, layer nursery owners who do on contract. They grow poultry for about 40 days or 40 to 45 days, and also broiler farms. So different sets of people are adversely affected here. Broiler birds piled up on the farms because there was no sale of broiler farms. But on the other hand, growers had to keep on feeding them, and feed costs were rising because soybean and maize was not being transported, and feed prices rose very drastically because of the disruption in that supply chain, and it affected the prices of feed here. Feed prices rose, and farmers simply decided to cull the birds in millions. One report spoke about one farmer culling about 100,000 chicken in his farm in just 2 days. And there are many such reports coming from different states. So culling of birds in millions was a very important feature. Eggs started piling up in the farms because there was no sale of eggs in this period. Chicken prices at the farm gate fell from 85 to 90 rupees per kg to about 5 to 10 rupees per kg during the lockdown. This is unbelievable, but it's true. The total losses estimated by the industry is about 27,000 crore till April 2020, and about 35,000 crore rupees till September. Demand is currently crawling up, but industry estimates point out that they're still at about 70% of the pre-COVID levels, and about 40% of the poultry producers closed down business during the lockdown. That is the evidence that comes out of the poultry sector. Other losses, now come to some of the losses estimated by industry bodies. I spoke about poultry feed, the raw materials used being maize and soybean. You can see that there was a lack of demand for poultry feed, which meant there was a drop in maize market price. So the changes in poultry sector were impacting farmers of maize and soybean. Demand for soybean dropped to less than 50% due to lack of demand from the poultry sector. That's one set of losses estimated by industry. These are figures from the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is called the FICCI, an industry body. They have put out these numbers. The total loss of in the sector of vegetables due to either they were not harvested or because they got perished is about rupees 50,000 crore for the vegetable sector. If similar losses have been reported in the sugarcane industry, Floriculture industry is supposed to have shrunk by 50%. The plantation crops, I've already mentioned the case of tea, coffee, etc. in the export numbers. They also suffered major disruption in exports, and that industry also suffered, both in production as well as processing and value addition. That's this next set of impacts that you see. Let us now come to the question of what happened to prices and inflation. The key point that I want to make is all the numbers that we showed till now show that there was a decline in the prices received by farmers, either be in the crop sector or poultry sector or meat sector or the milk sector. That's the number. Those are the numbers that you see. However, according to the Reserve Bank of India and the government, there is food inflation in India. Okay, and this food inflation is largely because of a major rise that you see in the retail market. So if you look at the consumer price index of specific commodities, that's the last column that you see in this. In most cases, they are rising. So you see this phenomenon whereby if you look at these prices, that is the mandi prices, which are closest to what we have. These are wholesale market prices, not exactly farm gate prices, but that's the closest that we have officially of the farm gate prices. They're either stable, or they are falling, or they are marginally rising somewhere, or they're stable. That's the kind of picture that you see in wholesale mandi prices where farmers go and sell. Come to wholesale price index, you will see that the picture slightly changes towards rise, right? More commodities are rising in terms of wholesale price index. And when you come into consumer price index, all these are rising, very clearly showing that supply chains continue to be in a state of major disruption across India. And this is the reason why you see food prices going up in the retail market. Supply chains are still in disruption. They have not recovered in any form, even though the lockdown is slowly being eased. And this in no way, the government claims that this rise in food inflation is actually benefiting the farmer through higher prices, but that's absolutely untrue. The farmer is faced with lower prices, but the consumer is faced with higher prices, and that is a process that has been continuing right through the period of lockdown. That's the point I wanted to make about prices and inflation. I shall now move into the question of agricultural inputs that you see. I shall quickly go through it. The major point is industries estimate that seed industry has shrunk by about 15 to 20%. Most farmers have used farm saved seeds and not certified seeds from the market. That might lead to a loss in productivity in the Kharif season that is a winter, that's a monsoon crop. The irrigation industry is shrunk by about 50%. Drip irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, that's the industry that we are talking about. Farm insurance industry, farm insurance claims have risen by 20%. That's another state indicator that we have of distress in the sector. But there is a point I want to make about farm equipment industry. The industry claims that the industry has shrunk by 10% during this time, basically through the sale of tractors and so on. If you look at the numbers, you will see a very interesting trend here, which is that if you see production of tractors, okay, these are different. This is 2019-20, and this is 2020-21. You will very clearly see that the production has declined between 2019-20 and 2020-21. But if you see sales, excluding exports, you see a slight increase. That's about 20,000 tractors have been sold additionally in 2020 as compared to 2019-20. And the government has been celebrating this aspect as a sign of rural revival. But interestingly, this sale has not happened in Punjab or Haryana, where government has procured more or where there is MSP and so on. In Punjab and Haryana, which are the epicenters of so-called agrarian prosperity in India, the sale of tractors actually fell in 2020. But it has actually risen in some of the eastern states, Odisha, Assam. These are the states which see a rise in the sale of tractors. So it's not very clear what has really caused this increase in sale of tractors, about 20,000 at the national level. But the point is that the production of tractors has seen a sharp fall, and the sale of tractors has indeed seen a minor marginal increase. But there's more examination is required of this data before we pass any final judgment on the matter. The other input sector which has seen some growth is fertilizer. For sure, fertilizer growth in India, fertilizer sales in India has increased in 2020 compared to 2019. And that you very clearly see both in total as well as the individual fertilizer groups that you will see: urea, diammonium phosphate, NPK mixtures, muriate of potash, etc. You will see that happening everywhere. But this is largely because of two reasons. Number one is there is enormous amount of stocking that is taking place in anticipation of the lockdown continuing for a long time. So traders have been stocking up fertilizers. Second is there has been an increase in the area sown in June. The June season, that is a Kharif season across India. You will see in most crops as a percentage of normal, which is 100, you will see most crops, food grains, pulses, sugarcane, oilseeds, fibers, etc. All of them show a rise in sown area in the June 2020 season compared to 2019 Kharif. That's largely because a large number of people have come back to the villages who were migrant workers in cities and so on. A lot of fallow land has been brought back into cultivation because this has been a state of food insecurity. I shall speak about it later. And this has meant that fertilizer sales have also concomitantly increased on the other side. So this is the reason why you see fertilizer sales increasing. The area sown in Kharif season has increased, and largely this is because of people looking for turning back into agriculture to find some amount of livelihood, which is missing in the urban or semi-urban areas in the form of non-agricultural employment. World Bank surveys show this very clearly. There's a 7% increase in the area sown for Kharif cultivation this monsoon. But the most interesting aspect is this, which is that smaller farmers have increased the sown area by about 10.6, while larger farmers have decreased their sown area by about 1.5%. This very clearly shows smaller farmers are looking for more secure food supply from their own land, and this has probably led to an increase in sown area in Kharif. They also show, in the case of fertilizers, which we spoke about, small farmers expect a 27.8% increase in fertilizer expenditure, but large farmers report a 13% decline in the fertilizer expenditure. So this also shows where the fertilizers are going. Small and marginal farmers have brought more land into cultivation, and that has led to more fertilizer sales. And that's what shows has a higher sales of fertilizers. Agricultural credit is the next item that I want to speak about. I shall quickly make my point. The point I'm trying to make is if the total sales of seeds fell and if the sales of fertilizers is increased, how did the farmer finance the new crop? Government has placed a lot of emphasis on monetary policy, in increasing the liquidity of economic units. And has that happened in agriculture? That's a question that we can ask. No is my emphatic answer. The reason is that if you see very clearly, this is quarter ending March and this is quarter ending June. Very clearly see that the growth rate, year-on-year growth rates of outstanding real credit, these are deflated numbers from scheduled commercial banks. If you see from in rural branches, it fell from 9.7 to 4.6%. In semi-urban branches, it fell from 9.7 to 1.7%. Similarly, if you take the quarter ending June, that's more important because June is the sowing season and that's when you need the credit, 10.4 to 3.6 and 9.0% to 1.4%, very close to zero. That's the kind of growth that you see in outstanding credit from rural branches. This is not agriculture, this is rural branches, okay? Now, come to agriculture, you very clearly see that the numbers are very clearly falling, both in the April-August quarter and the June-August quarter. The actual numbers of credit supplied has fallen, but this is more important. There has been across the last 4 or 5 years a sharp fall in the credit supply to agriculture. These are March numbers. This is cumulative in March. You can see the whole year's data culminating here is you can see a very clear fall, a trend across years. So all this has happened in the context of a fall in the growth of supply of agricultural credit from about 2015 onwards. That's the larger trend that you see. And last year was one of the lowest in the last 5 years. And this year is likely to be lower than that. all numbers thus show that growth of agricultural credit in 2020 has been lower compared to the growth of agricultural credit in 2019. And this is one of the lowest if you take the last 4 or 5 years. That is another very clear point that comes out. I shall skip this. I shall come to rural employment, which is a matter concerning rural laborers. Now, a few points have to be examined here. Size of the labor force participation rate, persons actively looking for employment, and persons actively not looking for employment. And then I shall come to some of the findings from primary surveys. Now, let me say this. There is a problem. There's an overall problem that you will note here. For example, these are CMI numbers of monthly rural sizes of the labor force. You'll very clearly see that the dip that you see from here is after March. So there's a sharp fall in the size of the labor force in April. It recovers in May, and then it sort of increases, but it's still lower than the figures for February 2020. This number that you see here. It is so for men, but for women, it's largely at the same level, but it is anyway low. But overall overall labor force sizes that if you see, they are lower than they were in February 2020. Point number one. Point number two, these are labor force participation rates. This is overall. The red one at the top, you can see is for 2019 for this, and the gray one at the top, below it is for 2020. You can see very clearly the numbers there. Here you will see that the numbers, if there was the labor force participation rates were 72.5 in February. They're still lower. They are recovered a little in September 2020, but they're still low. That's true from both men and women as farmers. One of the reasons why the rural labor force appears to have caught up in the absence of adequate amount of wage employment is because a lot of people have gone back to farming. So those who are self-employed as farmers, their numbers have increased in this period. So you'll very clearly see that about 1 million to 20 million people have come back as farmers in rural areas of India. About 20 million people are those who in June and July you see as those who are working as farmers over and above the number of farmers who were there in 2019. And that has been one important reason why rural labor force has been seen to be reviving. So it's not the generation of wage employment, which is very important. It's not that. That's not the reason. It's one important reason is the number of farmers has risen. Number two, the other important reason is an illusion. It's a data problem, which is that more careful unit level analysis of the CMI data have shown that if you take those people who were unemployed prior to February, and you consider them as in the labor force now, because they are not in the labor force now, because probably because of a discouraged worker effect, they have moved out of the labor force and are not actively looking for work. If you add them also, what appears from these numbers, if you actually look at the number of people who were employed before February and the number of people who don't have employment now, the unemployment rates are likely to be much higher than we actually notice from these numbers. Some of these numbers don't represent them because they are not in the labor force at all now, and hence their numbers don't reflect as unemployment rates also. So if that is added, the unemployment figures are likely to be much more adverse than we see. So in summary, available estimates are underestimates, but the size of the rural labor force in September 2020 compared to January is less by about 8.5 million persons. That's the broad that you can put from CMI number. But the World Bank surveys of July 2020 show that about 80% of the returned migrants intended to stay back at their village at least till August 2020. And this would mean that there would be a major fall in remittances because they would not be working in urban areas and sending money back into the village. Of the highest earning migrants from each household, 64% and 58% reported working for 0 days in the first week of May and June, respectively. That's another problem with the CMI data, which is that you still don't know how many days they have worked in that particular month. They may be reporting as in the labor force and employed also, but how many days in the month did they get employment and on what terms and conditions? That is also not clearly available from the data set. At least I have not been able to look at unit data sets, unit level data, because primarily because it's very expensive. I don't have money to buy it. But the published figures that they put out are very clear to put out the limited numbers that I have put out. Foundation for Agrarian Studies, April 2020, did surveys where they found that rain-fed villages were acutely affected by collapse of non-agricultural work in particular. Azim Premji University studies show that 57% in rural areas reported loss of employment, and casual workers were more hardly hit, with 66% reporting loss of employment in June and July. You're all aware of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which provides guaranteed rural employment for 100 days per household, theoretically. Now, allocation to MGNREGS was increased by the government by from 60,000 crore to about 100,000 crore in May 2020. The World Bank numbers for July, the World Bank survey numbers for July actually show among those who tried to get MGNREGA work in June 2020, 50% reported receiving no work, while 33% reported working for some days. That means MGNREGS has not been greatly effective, according to their survey. FAS surveys of April 2020 show that MGNREGS work had come to a complete halt in all the villages. Official data till August 2020 that we have now show that if you see June, July, and August, and May, June, July, and August, you will see that the numbers have risen between 2019 and 2020. More workers are working in MGNREGS compared to 2019-20 in 2021. But the question that we have to ask is this adequate? Given the large rise in unemployment that we have had, is this generation of work adequate in rural areas of India? If you look at it, on an average, 52 million households received employment from this scheme in the last 5 years. But if you take April to August of 2020, this number had risen to only 58 million households, not more than that. So that is inadequate given the scope and potential of an employment generation program of the sort that we are talking about. In the last 5 years, I shall complete my presentation in about 3 or 4 minutes, Jens. I'm coming towards the end of my talk. So in the last 5 years, 4.2 million households completed 100 days of work in a year. That is the one data that we have. But in 2020-21, if you look at those households, there are 2 points to make here. One is to say that only 0.68 million households, or 1.2%, have already completed 100 days of work. That's one set. But the other part of it, which the People's Action for Employment Guarantee informal group of scholars has raised, is that what happens to these people, because the guarantee is only for 100 days. That guarantee has not been raised. So once these people have completed 100 days, what about them for the rest of the year? Will they be denied work because they've already completed 100 days? That's one question which remains unanswered with regard to these workers. Another 5.1 million households have completed 70 days of work. They may soon complete 100 days of work. What after that is another question that the group has raised. About 15 million persons have demanded work, but they have not received any work also. It shows the huge amount of demand that exists for an REGS kind of work, but the government is unable to provide that kind of labor days. The highest denials of work has happened in Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Bihar, which has a very large part of the India's rural poor population as well. As on 9th September 2020, and at the additional amount that the government had put in to the MGNREGS program, the additional 40,000 crore had not yet been released, and there were also pending liabilities of about 481 crore to be paid as arrears for wages, for workers as wages. So MGNREGS has upscaled a little bit during the lockdown is very clearly seen in the form of higher number of people employed, but it has been hugely inadequate to meet the kind of demand for work that exists in rural areas. We should say both. It has risen, but it has not been adequate enough to meet the needs in rural areas. If you come to rural incomes, very clearly, these are the different sources of rural income that you have. Much of it I've already covered. This I've covered. This I have covered, and there are some. This I've covered. Some are remaining, and I shall come to the remaining parts in just a slide. The World Bank survey of 2020 July shows that the median respondent in their survey lost 57% of their weekly earnings between March and May of 2020. However, the weekly earnings recovered, but it reached only 1/3 of the pre-lockdown levels of March 2020. About 40% of the non-agricultural households reported zero income in June 2020. But this 40% was a good thing because it had declined from 71% in May 2020, but it was still bad because it was 18% only in March. So you can see 18% to 71% to 40%. That's a timeline of these numbers here. Some income recovery is there, but it continues to be, has continued, at least in June, it was particularly acute for about 40% of the non-agricultural households. FAS studies actually show that wealthier households survived better than manual worker households during the lockdown, as they could fall back on savings and other income sources, which they could fall back on the dissavings while others could not. Rural food consumption has also suffered very badly as a consequence of these fall in rural incomes and employment. In fact, World Bank survey shows that 47% of households with signs of food insecurity in May 2020 continued to be reporting as food insecure in July 2020. Most of them had limited their portion sizes, or they had simply reduced the number of meals they took during the day. FAS studies in April showed that household consumption fell. There was also reduction in the diversity of food consumed. For landlords and capitalist farmers, this was largely because of supply chain disruptions, because of which food items were not available in the market. But for poor peasant and manual worker households, even if goods were available in the market, they wouldn't have bought it because there was a sharp reduction of their incomes during the lockdown period. Surveys by International Food Policy Research Institute in Haryana and Odisha, they also show a very sharp decline in food consumption in rural areas, particularly in Haryana. Surveys by the Azim Premji University also show very similar results. So most surveys that you have, primary surveys that you have in this period, attest to the fact that there was a sharp fall in rural food consumption. Obviously, the corollary is an increase in hunger in rural areas. This is despite the fact that India has record stocks of rice and wheat in its godowns. You can see here, the blue line that you see here is the buffer stock that is required officially in the government godowns. But you can see last few years, you very clearly see a sharp rise in the excess of stocks over the buffer stock norms. But the government has not been able to pull this out of the godowns and distribute it to the poor who are hungry. The size of the PDS was expanded. The ration shop provisions were expanded. There was some amount of food grains provided that were free of cost, but the government could have done much more by draining out much more of their food stocks from their Food Corporation of India godowns and giving it to the poor. And that is particularly coming out very starkly in the kinds of hunger that have stalked the rural areas during the lockdown. The government could have pushed a lot more grains from its godowns to the poor, but it failed to do so. I come to my last slide, which is about policy response in the way ahead. I would love to take a lot more questions in this. I'd like to keep my comments brief in this for these two slides. My summary is this: that the government's package for agriculture, however, was marked by a complete lack of interest in financially assisting the farmers. It announced a scheme called the Atmanirbhar scheme, self-reliant India. That was the idea put forward in that scheme. But only about 5% of that of the total financial outlay for that scheme was supposed to be coming from the budget of the government. The rest was all liquidity enhancing effects, more loans from banks and so on. Direct financial assistance, direct payment from the budgets of the government constituted only about 5% of the total size of the package. That is the most important point. Most of the announcements were rehashed schemes already announced in the previous budgets, and many were simply loan-based schemes. The government's effort was also to transfer the burden of the crisis on the farmers and the working class. It did not increase the minimum support price by a significant level during the lockdown, though it did procure more. That, to be fair, it did procure more, but at a lower MSP than it could have paid to the farmers. So in that sense, it does constitute an economic squeeze of the peasantry in the rural areas. Much more could have been put into the rural areas by financially assisting the farmers. Crisis as an opportunity to push a set of neoliberal reforms in agriculture, particularly in agricultural marketing. It brought out 3 farm acts in the month of September, which earlier as ordinances, then later passed in the parliament. This has been very controversial. Farmers many North Indians with the agricultural sector out, they're protesting against these acts. I think I lost my voice for a while, but I hope I'm back. These 3 farm acts have been extremely controversial, and there is a big protest movement of farmers going on at this time. That is another part of the story. What is needed? That's my last slide. What is needed? The rural Indian agriculture also. This is something that the situation really demands at this point of time. But the government has not yet been forthcoming. Loans, there could have been a higher cash transfer, there could have been more investment in rural infrastructure creation. All these could have been done through the different packages of the government, but it is yet to be forthcoming. We also need sectoral relief packages. The losses in dairy, poultry, meat, etc., are very large, and the producers, in particular small producers in these sectors, are looking forward to some amount of relief from the government, yearning for more investment and spending, particularly because the pandemic is yet to spread into rural areas in full scale. That's a crisis that is waiting to happen, and that would require higher investment in rural health, which has also not yet happened. You need to increase the number of days of employment from 150 to 200, from 100 days to about 150 to 200 days of work per household, and that's something that the government has not been ready to put out through its announcements. So this is what I think is required. So what I was trying to say in the Indian countryside, in Indian agriculture, has been significant. The pandemic has not yet entered the rural areas as much as it has already because of loss of pandemic is yet to enter the rural areas, but the economic losses are already significant in the rural areas. And the government response to this pandemic to argue in the later part of my presentation. Thank you very much. I shall stop my initial set of comments here. I think I exceeded by about 5 to 7
Thank
minutes,
you.
my allotted time. I apologize to Jens.
Thank you, Ramakumar. You are unfortunately breaking up quite a lot right now here towards the end. So some of your conclusions also didn't go as clearly through as possible. But let us thank you for the. Let us give you a big thanks. We can't clap all together, but at least I can clap on behalf of the rest of the audience. So thank you very much for this presentation. If you can unshare your screen, then we can get a proper screen to look at all together. That would be great. Now, I thought this was an extraordinary presentation. It was so rich. It was so full of both details, but also as you went through it, it became clearer and clearer how serious the crisis actually is, even if it is so that COVID hasn't reached fully the countryside. From figures of export that looked okay, it became clearer and clearer that prices were falling, that people were returning, that there were no work for them, that they even have to take up what little agriculture they can, and that it's actually, as far as I can understand, primarily small farmers that are suffering more than bigger ones in this picture. Though of course that requires more details to get a full understanding of that. I thought it was also telling that you're saying that in this picture, 80% of the migrants expect to stay back. So even though the situation in agriculture is really serious and appalling, it is worse elsewhere. Then it doesn't make sense for them to go elsewhere. They have to somehow find a way of surviving where they are in the countryside. So a dire situation that can only get worse unless something is done. Now, just a couple of small questions and one big question. So firstly, why is there a growth in export of the basic crops? What is it that's going on here in a situation where prices are increasing in the cities, where prices are falling for the farmers, and then the export is increasing? What is going on there for these crops? And the second sort of small issue, but it is actually an enormous issue. What do we know about what returnees do, those that do not have land? Because you're saying there is no increase in wage labor within agriculture. So if there is up towards 100 million seasonal migrants returning, and there's an increase of 20 million in agriculture, what are the rest doing? How do they survive? That seems to be a major issue there. So these are two small questions, and could you lift the lid on the kind of reforms that government of India is now undertaking to try and solve the crisis, or to utilize this crisis to push through a reform of Indian agriculture? What is it that they claim that can be done? Because they must have a narrative that these reforms will somehow help the agrarian crisis. So what is it they're claiming that will help that crisis? So these are my initial questions, but basically we now open the floor for questions, both in the chat, and Shreya and Enrique will monitor the chats and bring things from the chat to you, and I will try to monitor the hands as they are raised, which I'm sure I will not succeed fully in, but hopefully I can spot some hands as they are raised. But first, maybe you can give there's a hand raising function, Judith, which you also managed to use before, I think. So, but can we just have first quick responses from Kumar on these questions while people put their hands up, etc.
Thanks, Jens. I hope my connection is better now. I hope I'm not breaking up. Okay, the first question was about exports. The key point here is that what India has done is that it has procured a lot more quantity from the farmers this year compared to last year. But however, that cannot be exported out. That cannot be exported out, because if you export that out, that will be a violation of the WTO provision. So that cannot be exported out. What has been exported out is the rest, from the rest, largely by exporters of basmati rice and also sugar, etc. In both these areas, rice and sugar, and later in wheat. In fact, I presented data only till August. If you look at September data, a lot of wheat has also been additionally exported, along with rice and sugar. These are crops which are available in surplus in India, which have had an export market. But I think it needs more detailed work, more interviews with bureaucrats and so on. But my own understanding is that India has worked hard with its embassies across the world to see wherever export opportunities for food grains are opening up, and it has managed to somehow promote more exports of rice and wheat into those specific markets. Across the world, different food importing countries are stocking up rice and wheat in anticipation of a longer lockdown period. So that is also helping Indian exports, because whatever is available in surplus of your requirement, the government is able to allow it to be exported. So that is happening in rice, wheat, and sugar, where India has some amount of surplus that is available at this point of time. Now, coming to other crops which are economically very important, that is marine products, meats and meat products, spices, tea, coffee, etc., which affects a large number of workers and farmers, etc. There, the exports have fallen. Exports are not anywhere near the levels of 2019, particularly in marine and meat products. So what I was trying to say was, except in the case of rice, wheat, and sugar, you do not see that rosy picture with respect to exports. And in these three crops, the rosy picture is largely because India happens to have a surplus. The world, many countries across the world happen to be demanding more and more to increase their stockpiles. And India is actually taking advantage of that increased demand for food grains in the global market by pushing out a little more of rice and wheat, which has helped it in a macro sense to keep agricultural export incomes largely comparable between 2019 and 2020. So its claim has been that we have done wonderfully well in the export sector, but what it hides is the enormous variations that exist across commodities. And those commodities where the exports have fallen drastically are also some of those sectors which are hugely labor intensive, which involves both farmers and industrial workers in the sense of processing firms and so on, fish processing, meat processing, all these involve a large labor force. Those have been shut down. So the livelihood impacts of that fall in exports have been significant. So that's why I wanted to say that very prominently, that the fact that export incomes have not fallen drastically does not mean that all is well. You've managed to do well, and that's because of the global demand situation that you have during this time. But you have done very badly with respect to export of a large number of other commodities, as I mentioned, marine products, meat, tea, coffee, spices, etc. So I'm not quite surprised by this, but while I might want to salute the smartness of some of our Commerce Ministry officials in being able to keep export incomes constant and thus trying to claim a great amount of good points for the government. But I don't think it has that kind of positive impact on the lives of farmers and laborers in other sectors where exports have sharply fallen. That's my answer to that question. The second question of yours was related to returnees without land. I think they're simply unemployed. The simple answer to your question is they're unemployed. In many, when they came back to the villages in the month of April, there was some work there, largely because the harvest of the Rabi crop, the wheat crop in northern states in particular, was ongoing, which meant that they got some work in the villages when they came back to the villages. Some were also, those with land were able to cultivate some land, but those without land had got some employment in April, but not in May, June, etc. They may have got a little employment during sowing and plowing operations in June, probably. But apart from these two probable small spurts of employment, that too for a few days, it is unlikely that they would have received substantial levels of employment in the villages itself. So they've remained unemployed, and they're with many are with zero incomes, as many of the surveys showed very clearly. And this also shows up in falling rural food consumption as well. They've also not been eating adequate amount of food during this time. So their condition has they're the most acutely affected section in rural areas for sure. Returnees without land. For sure. The three farm acts, Jens, that requires a lot of time to explain, but I shall just say that I personally do not think that a capsule, as they say, I personally do not see an enormous amount of private investment in agricultural marketing, establishment of private markets, rural collection centers, storage infrastructure, warehousing infrastructure, and so on. That's the claim of the government. But I do not see that happening, partly because I do see enormous amount of structural constraints to the entry of private huge amounts of transaction costs in procuring commodities from farmers. They much prefer going to an APMC wholesale mandi and buying from there rather than going to the farmers directly and buying, which means that you will have to strike contracts with millions of farmers, check their qualities, incurred storage costs, loading costs, unloading costs, transport costs, etc., etc. All this is amounts to significant some crops, some regions here and there, the amount of private investment coming because of these farm acts. But in specific cases, I do see a significant amount of private investment that is likely to come. But if you look at the experience that we have in different states, you will see that these private markets do not pay any higher price to farmers compared to the existing APMC mandis that you have. In fact, a lot of research by scholars who are working in this area, Professor Sukhpal Singh, Professor Sudha Narayan, and others, will show you that a lot of these the prices that these private markets pay to these farmers are after accounting for the significant transaction costs they will incur. And in many cases, and my own feeling is that in many cases, the transaction costs are likely to be higher than the mandi taxes that are currently paid by traders to the APMC mandis. In such circumstances, you will see that the farmer prices are likely to be lower rather than higher after the reform. But so somebody will make profit. I see a question and I'll take it up later in the chat box. regarding to merchant capital, I'll take it up later, but result of these reforms.
Yes.
But I do see some amount of private investment flowing into some crops, some regions, etc., and they might make windfall gains there.
But the danger is potential lower prices. But let us move on to Judith here, and then go to the chat where Enrique, I know, has collected a number of questions. Judith.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, fine.
Okay. I have two questions. One is, what about the PDS? This whole question of food and food distribution, and why have you not said anything about PDS? I thought that your discussion was fantastic, and you've covered so many things. But the question of whether food distribution could be increased, has been increased, whether that's not possible is very important, it seems to me. The other thing is that very interesting work by Isabel Guerra and her colleagues in Tamil suggests that one wonders how people survive, that people are going back to all sorts of old dependency relations in order to get credits, supplies, get some way of surviving in this situation. So she sees a real reaction now into older forms of dependency and older agrarian relations, which sets the whole thing back by decades in India. I wonder if that's something else which you might comment on. Thank you.
Ramakumar?
Yes, Judith, thanks for that question. The point about PDS, yes, I could not spend a lot of time. I could not spend a lot of time on PDS in my presentation. I'm aware of that. But the point I was making is the following. The government increased supply of food grains from the PDS and added pulses to the basket. And a part of it was also given as free of cost. But the point is that while that was a commendable step, no doubt about it, and that was one of the things that helped a lot of rural households to survive through the period of lockdown. My own argument has been that the government could have pushed down rice and wheat from Jens, did you lose me for a while?
No,
okay.
it's fine.
My own understanding, yeah, my own understanding has been that the government could have pushed out a lot more of its food stocks into the open market, into the homes of people. That could have been done. In fact, instead of 10 kilograms, the government could have given 15 or helped them immensely during this period. So there has been some expansion in the activity in PDS, but a lot more could have been done. That's the broader point that I want to make with respect to PDS. How do people survive in the villages? That's a very difficult question, because most of the surveys that I reported from World Bank or IFPRI or Foundation for Agrarian Studies or Azim Premji University, all of them are telephonic surveys. So this is one moment when a lot of people who went to surveys earlier are repenting why they didn't collect phone numbers also when they did their surveys, because they could have called them during the lockdown. But many people, yeah. But now everybody will start collecting phone numbers during primary surveys. That's going to be one change. But the point is that we have very little evidence as to how rural relations have changed during the pandemic, during the lockdown, how labor relations underwent any change during the lockdown. We have very little qualitative information at this point of time as to how some of these changes have taken place. We only have some broad quantitative indicators: income, employment, food consumption, etc., which is what I try to present in my presentation. However, there are anecdotal descriptions that are available by journalists, some scholars, etc., that there is a rise in caste-based oppression in Indian villages during this time. That has been reported by many observers. The second important point noted by many has been also a rise in gender-based oppression during this time, particularly with respect to intra-household reporting of violence against women. That has also been reported by many observers during this period. So you do see a rise in caste-based oppression and gender-based oppression, but that data is not data that you have from that is not data that you from systematic surveys of any kind. These are partly anecdotal, partly observers and so on, but you need more data to say more about some of these aspects. But there is some evidence there is a rise in caste and gender-based oppression in the villages. So that might be one indicator of how some labor relations or production relations may have been undergoing a change, but I don't want to speculate too much on that aspect as of now. I would wait for more concrete information to come before saying anything assertive in that regard.
Oh, that is, you are a true economist. No, that is you are right in not pushing the boat out further than the data can actually carry. But it is interesting to see these qualitative studies, nevertheless. I think, and I think you were also saying so. Because these are, of course, speculations, but what is actually happening with caste and class and gender in the villages as a consequence of this, I guess, is what many of us would like to know more of, and that is just so difficult to get a proper understanding of at this point in time. I will hand over to Enrique, who has a number of who can report from the chat and people that have put questions to him directly.
Right. Hello. Well, thank you for your presentation. It was really good. Lots of data, indeed. The first question is actually my question. So if you would like to start with that one, I was just wondering, what's the situation of these merchants that seem to be profiting from the situation. But then
Enrique, my request to you is, could you please be a little louder? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I think it's this mic today. Now, I was saying the first question is actually my question. I'm sort of intrigued about the merchants and how if they are the ones that are profiting from the situation. Because if it's the case that farmers are not getting good prices and consumers are also getting higher prices with the products, then somebody is gaining here. And I just want you to expand on that a little, if it's possible, if that's the case. And then we have a couple of questions from the YouTube channel from Shruti. So the first one would be if you can tell us more about, variation differences.
Enrique, can you please, I'm very sorry, but can you please repeat your question? I didn't hear it properly. Can you please repeat your question, please?
Right.
I couldn't hear it
properly.
No,
don't worry. No. It's actually written in the chat, but I can read it again. My question is, I was wondering, what is the situation of merchants there? Because if it's the case that farmers are not getting good prices, yes, and the consumers also, yeah, so that would be one. And then we have other two questions. Perhaps you saw those as well from the YouTube channel from Shruti. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Enrique. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Now, to answer Enrique's question, if farmers and consumers are losing out, is it the case that certain forms of merchant capital? I do see that trader margins have risen significantly in this in this period, but it has also to be qualified with the point that costs have also risen. Costs of trucks have risen, wages of some truck drivers have risen. So both costs and margins in trade have risen. Now, how much of that increase in total cost is costs and how much of that is increased or expanded margins of traders is not very clear at this point of time. Somebody has made money somewhere, and it's largely in the supply chain, in the trading network. But part of that is also increase in a genuine increase, and your question would hold true if margins have risen as much as costs as well. So I don't know. We still don't know how that network has been operating in an economic sense during the period of lockdown. We, however, know that costs have risen. But to how much to what extent they have risen, and how much of that has gone as margin, we still don't know. Yes, certain sections are likely to have made some quick bucks and made windfall gains, but I'm not in a position to tell you who they might be or what kind of processes they may have adopted to make that kind of a windfall gain. That would have to wait for more concrete studies to emerge at the other end of the law. So I would basically say that I won't be able to confidently put forward the argument that merchant capital has significantly gained in this process, because I'm not very sure if that is indeed the case. So I'll only say this much at this point of time. I should not venture out and speculate more on this point at this point of time. If I'm to take the other points that are there in the chat box, from Shruti Nagbhushan, could you tell us a little bit about state-wise differences in market arrivals? Yes. Unfortunately, the table was not there in my presentation, but I can tell you that there are major statewide differences. In states where the state governments were able to put in more local efforts to keep their supply chains working, market arrivals have been higher compared to other states. So that's one broad point that I could make. Which exactly those states are, I'm not able to tell you now, but I can certainly let you know later in an email. I have more detailed tables available with me. But the point is very clear that there are very clear state-wise differences. Some states have done better. Is agricultural credit mentioned only from commercial banks, or does it also involve cooperative credit figures also? No. India's figures figures on cooperative credit in India are well known for their lack of reliability on the one hand, and the huge which they are released on the other. Sometimes you get the data only after 3 to 4 years. So that has been a serious problem. The data that I presented was only from scheduled commercial banks, which is what is available readily on a monthly basis from official agencies. So it does not include credit given from agricultural cooperative credits, cooperative societies. I do not see any other question in the chat box. If there are more, if you could paste it there, I could try to answer them.
Yeah. We have a set of, thanks Ramakumar, we have another set of questions that have come to Shreya via the live feed and elsewhere. So over to you, Shreya.
Okay, thanks. So we have a couple of questions from Sheetal, who the first of her questions is, we saw migrant laborers returning back to villages, which increased the burden on rural areas to accommodate them. And do you think, is the government thinking of any industry expansion in rural areas which could absorb them, or perhaps if you see some scope for that? Another question is, if fallow lands have come under cultivation now, were these used to cultivate food crops, which will for sure take care of the family's food requirement in the coming year? But if this land is used for commercial crops, again, these small farmers will be caught in the grips of traders. So any comment on that? And we have another question from Spandan, who's asking, what are some of the additional measures in the March to August period that the government could have taken to prevent the sharp fall of the prices of commodities that resulted in huge losses for the farmers or rural producers. And maybe I'll just pile on to that and ask my own question and be a bit of a devil's advocate and say that since, you know, I was really struck by, you know, just how much of a breakdown of supply chains it has been internationally and domestically. And I just wonder, you know, where can we, you know, is there any place where we can cut some slack to the state, or you know what was in their control and what wasn't, is what I'm really asking, according to you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay,
thanks, Shreya. Yeah, thanks. I'll take that question from Sheetal to begin with, about migrants and whether migrant workers and whether the government plans to do anything. The government investment in the rural areas cannot be in the form of new government enterprises. That is highly unlikely. But what the government could do is to invest heavily in the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program to begin with. And I think the state of rural unemployment is likely to remain extremely bad through the coming year. The ongoing year, at least up to January, February, and so on. Rural non-agricultural employment is not showing any signs of picking up in any substantive sense. So the government will have to come in and expand its public works program. That is the NREGS in rural areas. I'm a strong advocate of increasing the number of days of work from guaranteed work from 100 days to 150 or 200 days for households. And that would substantially help in improving rural incomes on the one hand, and also increasing rural demand for your overall economic revival prospects in the coming year. So I do see that. In the urban areas, there is a strong demand that is emerging. I'm again a votary of that, of an urban employment guarantee program in the same lines of the rural employment guarantee program that we have had from 2006. Only one state in India currently has an urban employment guarantee program, which is Kerala, which is called the Ayankali Urban Employment Guarantee Program. That has to be, when you do it in other states, it has to be different. But the template is out there, and the government can use it to do different kinds of employment generation programs in urban areas. The only difference between the rural and urban programs being that there will be an additional skilled component involved in the urban employment guarantee programs as compared to the rural employment guarantee program. So there will be differences, but you have much to learn from how you have done with the rural program, and you should begin an urban program as well. So these are the 2 points that I would say with respect to what the government should do in the rural areas. The second point was about fallow lands. The available data that we have does show that a lot of fallow lands that have been brought back into cultivation are in rice, maize, and oilseeds. These are the 3 crops in which we see more fallow lands being used for. You do not yet see a major shift into cash crops or commercial crops of the kind that you mentioned. At this point of time, in my view, people are looking for assured food security, and they are not looking for linking up with world markets and so on. That's not what people are looking for. Currently, people are looking for improved food security, maybe some pulses, oil seeds, etc. That's and maize, because maize is in a huge demand nowadays. So those are the crops where more farmers appear to have moved into during this period. The last point was about what the government could have done. I should cut some slack, as Shreya suggested. Now, I agree. Let me put it this way. I'm not saying that the government did not do anything. Okay, the government did a lot of things. Any government would have done, and I don't see that to. I don't say this is some speciality of this government. In fact, a lot of state governments did a stellar job in managing the lockdown compared to the absolute mess that the central government created on the 23rd at 8 o'clock, 23rd March at 8 o'clock, when it gave just 4 hours for the whole country to be shut down at 12 midnight that day. It is one of the most, after demonetization, we call him the 8 p.m. Prime Minister. That is, whenever he comes out at 8 p.m. on TV, people are scared. Oh God, in 4 hours something is going to happen, right? So the nationally mismanaged lockdown had its impacts on states, but states scrambled to manage the lockdown. Some of them succeeded, some of them did not, and there's a good amount of literature that is available to read up on that. But the point, so the government gave front-loaded a little bit of the PM Kisan payouts to farmers. The government expanded PDS a little bit by 5 kilograms per household of rice and wheat, and we added 1 kilogram of pulses. All that the government did because it had the kind of food stocks available to do that. My point is that there are 2 points that I want to make. The first point is, did the government do enough? That's the question that we have to ask. There was much more that the government could have done, given the kind of food stocks that it had. It could have pushed a lot more rice and wheat into, and which could have helped them avert the problem of declining food consumption. Number one. Number two, they simply refuse to borrow or monetize the deficit and spend more in the rural areas. That's one key important, one big problem that I see. They are still sticking on to the ideology of austerity. They are not ready to raise their fiscal deficit beyond 1 or 2 percentage points. When the whole world is going up to 10% of the GDP, you are still stuck at about 4 or 5%. You're not ready to go beyond that. So the government could have spent a lot more to expand rural employment. Look at Trump. Look at Donald Trump. The United States government calculated price difference between August and May and looked at the average quantity sold by a farmer. They calculated the economic loss for the farmer and paid 80% of the loss as cash to the farmer. Right? This was Donald Trump. You could argue that it was an election year and he did that, but they did that. Right? But the point is that India was nowhere near that kind of. Obviously, you don't have the resources as the US. The US has the global currency. It can print as much as it wants, etc. All that agreed. But the point is, you should, if they have walked 10 steps, you should at least walk 2 steps. And I think that was completely missing on the part of this government. They could have expanded rural employment. They could have increased the PM Kisan payouts to farmers. They could have created an urban employment guarantee program. A lot of things the government could have done. They could have put a lot more food into the houses of people. They didn't do it. So if you ask me, did they do something? Yes, they did that. I will cut some slack there. I will say not at all.
Thank you, Ramakumar. And I think with that, and in a fitting way, we have reached the conclusion of the session. So I will thank you on behalf of the organizers and of everyone here for the spirited and detailed overview that also gave a very good understanding of the big picture of the tendencies that are going on, and not the least of the policy issues that really matters now. And really we can only worry what will happen in the next half to full year if COVID, as it probably will, goes further into the countryside. If this is what is now with these policies, what will happen in the future? But such is life, and I wish you well in your discussions and attempt to influence policy in India, so that the best possible will at least not the worst feared for will be the outcome. So thanks a lot, Ramakumar, and thanks to my co-host and to everyone else. Before I finish and draw this to a close fully, let me point out that our next webinar will be in 2 weeks' time on the 28th of October, where Shabanatnan will talk on the Rohingya peasantry of Myanmar, a limiting case of agrarian change, disintegration by state violence, ethnic persecution, and land grabs. But for now, for today, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.